Hey, Miss Jody, how are you? I'm doing all right. Can you hear me? Hey, Vincy Lou Who, how are you? Jody, I just want you to know that this weather we've been having lately is not normal for February, okay? So, do y'all want music or not? Feeling better? Hey, bitch! What up? Yeah, sunburn yesterday. I could see how that could happen. And now for the next 2 days, we gotta 2 3 days, we gotta wait for it to flood us out. Nina may or may not be on here tonight. Um, she's her house has been infected with COVID, so yeah, I got my other youngin this weekend, Sawyer. So I need a pretty weekend because when it's only one here, they depend on me to entertain them, and he's one of those that he likes his tablet for a little while, but then he wants you to pay attention to him, and that's always hard. Let's see, what are we gonna listen to tonight? Hmm. Doobie Brothers. Most of y'all probably don't even know who the Doobie Brothers are. Oh, Karen is boss. Is your boss lady gonna be here tonight? Not Neener. Into Sam. She's your wife. She's not your boss lady. I'm talking about Leann. All right. I'm going to go ahead and start reading. It's 10 after, so. And I got the right book this time. So let's see what you're dragging me into tonight. Swapped over. Omega slaves. Yay. Used Omega Market Book 1. Alrighty. Hey, she's got a bunch of books written. Alright, chapter 1. You better listen tonight, sister. To be Omega is to be subjugated. That's a word I don't use every day. Dominated, enslaved. But it's also to be wanted, desired, and valued. Other Omegas tried to hide from their fate, tried to have a say in when and who they mated. It never worked. They would be found, caught, dragged, crying, and fighting the whole way. The end was always the same. Their biology was used against them. Oh, side note here while I'm thinking about it, because I just got off the phone with my girl. She did get emergency custody of the boys. I want to say March 22nd, 24th, 22nd, something like that, is our court date. Maybe it's 23rd. This is on Thursday. Is the court date. Baby daddy's been keeping the roads hot, so they can't nail him down to serve him his papers. But he does know what's going on, and she texts him every day. Do you want to see the boys? Although she will be supervising that, but she's doing it more just to make sure that they can't say, well, you didn't ever offer, that kind of thing. So we don't know what he's planning right now, but she does have the boys, so that's a good thing. Alrighty. Other Omegas tried to hide from their fate, tried to have a say in when and who they mated. It never worked. They would be found, caught, dragged, crying and fighting the whole way. The end was always the same. Their biology was used against them. If they were lucky enough to be found before their heat, that is, they're always found once they go into heat. Nothing can hide that scent from an alpha, and the result could be unpleasant. It was easier just to do what the law said. Go to the collection center and avoid the stress. Hiding away in the dark, half starving in the cold, just to put off what was going to happen anyway, seemed pointless. Showing up willingly, clean and docile, and not scrawny from lack of food seemed like the smarter way to go. Elise thought she would get a better price that way, and it's obvious if someone can pay more for an Omega, then they should have plenty for a decent home and food to eat. One could hope they would take care of their investment. Having a young, willing Omega that didn't try to escape or cry before she was bonded should be worth something. According to the law, every Omega was to present themselves to a collection center before their first heat to be matched with an alpha with complementary genetics who would then bond and mate them during their first cycle. Since Omegas matured slower than the other dynamics, that usually meant somewhere around their 20th to 21st year. They were told that it was for the good of future generations, that this was the way to assure diseases and genetic disorders were eradicated and that their children were strong. I'm gonna have to have a little this is a little message to Miss Leann. Quit using all these big words. I'm getting tongue tied. They were, let's see, Elise knew that in reality, omegas were a commodity like any other to be sold to the highest bidder, used for wealth and gain. Some species naturally produce more omegas than others, and they became a great way to create alliances throughout the different worlds, especially for Earth, since human alphas were even more rare than omegas were, and human females were compatible with any race. Alphas had to pay a premium to access the omega market, and the more they paid, the more choices they had. The women were filed in a galactic database where the alphas could put in their preferences and browse through the options. Though they wouldn't have long to decide, bidding would begin as soon as the omega's information was listed. Being virginal was not a requirement. Most omegas wanted their first time to be with who they chose, since they couldn't choose their mate unless they were from an extremely wealthy family who could pull strings to keep them off the market. Elise figured it was another thing that would increase her value, though. So she had waited. None of the beta males had ever interested her enough to make her think twice about it. She brushed her blonde hair until it shone and lay about her shoulders and down her back in a straight sheet. Her bangs? Sorry, y'all. I'm not sleepy. It's just the way it does me. Hey, Miss Billy. I got the right book tonight, by the way. Her bangs freshly trimmed to hang just right. She was wearing a dress she made specifically for this occasion. It was a deep blue that matched her eyes, and it hugged her curves enough to hint at what was underneath without being indecent. Elise had spent the last month making it from cloth she'd used all of her savings to purchase. Every credit she had earned, found, and been given was invested into this day. She used a finger to smudge a bit of soot on her eyelids and stepped back from the small piece of broken mirror on the wall. This was it. This was the day she had been planning for since she knew she was an omega. Looking around the room one last time before stepping out and shutting the door behind her, Elise sighed. It had hardly been bigger than the single bed pressed against the wall and didn't hold anything important to her. She left a note on the bed for the girls she lived with so they would know what happened and that they could let someone else have the room and the things she left behind. She had done the same with her boss. Elise knew they wouldn't agree with her decision, but that was fine. A couple of them were omegas still holding out. Elise was younger than them since she just turned 20. But lost my place. But the others had no plans to turn themselves in. She decided long ago that her 20th birthday would be the day. There was no reason for her to wait since she was of legal age. Elise stepped out of the building into the cool air with just a small bag over her shoulder. It had a couple of pair of clothes and not much else. She didn't have anything of value to bring with her. It was cold enough that standing still left her a bit chilled, without a jacket, but walking to the center would warm her up. She turned down the street without looking back. She had no reason to, with no sentimental attachment to look to where she had lived the past couple of years. Elise had known she would be leaving it before she got there and had no second thoughts now that the time had come. This was what was best for her. Elise stopped a block from the center. It hadn't been too long of a walk, and she had taken her time so she wouldn't arrive sweaty. But she still wanted to stop and freshen up for a moment. First impressions could make a difference. Once her breathing had slowed to a gentle rise and fall, she crossed the last bit of sidewalk leading her to her destiny. Taking the stairs up to the front doors, her heart began to race. No one knew what was past them. No omega to enter the center had ever returned, and the people who worked there would be the last to talk about what happened with them. Fingers pressed to the handle, Elise paused, a shiver running down her spine. There was no turning back once she stepped through. Her life would no longer be her own. I think I've read this book. Karen, could I have read this book already like a year or so ago? No, not live. Not live. I want to say this is one of the first Omega books I'd ever read. Elise stopped a block from the center. It hadn't been too long of a walk, and she had taken her time so she wouldn't arrive sweaty, but she still wanted to stop and freshen up for a moment. First impressions could make a difference. Once her breathing had slowed to a gentle rise and fall, she crossed the last bit of sidewalk leading her to her destiny. Hey, Jackie! What's up, sister? I think this is one of the first Omega books I'd ever read. Taking the stairs up to the front door, her heart began to race. No one knew what was past them. No Omega to enter the center had ever returned, and the people who worked there would be the last to talk about what happened. Fingers pressed to the handle, Elise paused, a shiver running down her spine. There was no turning back once she stepped through. Her life would no longer be her own. Thinking of the dreary, worn down buildings she had passed and breathing in the smog laced air of the city, Elise straightened her shoulders and pulled. There wasn't much that could be worse than her life. Worked to exhaustion every day of the year, she was used to the disappointments of life and could take whatever was behind those doors. Stepping through the entrance of the collection center, the first thing Elise noticed was the cold. Where the temperature outside was chilly, the air in the building felt like she had stepped into a refrigeration unit. The walls were a plain white, scuffed and dirty around the base, with a single abstract photo hanging in the center of the room. The white floor tiles were in even worse shape, cracked and dull with age and lack of care. A fake tree in a green pot stood in a corner to her right, its leaves drooping with the mass of dust collected on them, and three dull blue plastic chairs set against the far wall. It was disappointing. The desk sitting at an angle in the far left corner was empty, and Elise hesitated, unsure what to do. As the door to the outside swung shut behind her, she looked between the desk and the partially open door on the other side. Elise could hear voices echoing out from the opening, so she crept closer to the desk, hoping someone would come out. By the time she stopped in front of it, there was still no sign that anyone would be coming to greet her. Unsure what else to do, she called out a shaky, "Hello?" The voices from the other room stopped before she heard shuffling and footsteps heading her way. Straightening, she crossed her hands over her bag, trying to slow her breathing. A head of messy blonde hair popped through the opening, brows drawn together in confusion over plain brown eyes. When he noticed Elise, he pushed his way through the door to stand behind the desk. "Hello, miss. Are you lost?" His tone and question made it obvious that not many people passed through this lobby. Taking a deep breath, Elise spoke before she lost the nerve. "I'm here to turn myself in." The look of confusion didn't leave his face as he stared back at her. "For collection. I'm an Omega." His eyes widened, lips parting as his jaw dropped. Her racing heart made it seem longer than it probably was before he shook his head, throat working as he looked down at his desk. "Yes, of course." Gaze flitting over the bare surface between them, he leaned down and yanked open a drawer. The screech it released another sign of disuse and neglect. Pulling out an old tablet, he cleared his throat as he tried to get it to turn on. Elise could see color creeping up his neck to his cheeks as the screen refused to light. Dropping it back into the drawer, his eyes landed on the outdated laptop sitting on the corner of the desk. Fumbling it open, he let out an audible sigh of relief when it cooperated. I have a form for you to fill out. I'll pull it up on the computer and you can sit at my desk to answer the questions while I go get one of our nurses. Nurse? Oh, yes, baby girl, omegaverse. And I'm pretty sure this was the first one I had ever read. And I liked it okay. And I got another book that I read and I didn't like it as well. So, she blurted the word out, before she could stop herself, and his head jerked to her face. Everyone gets an exam when they arrive to be sure they are in good health. Just routine. Everyone, let's see, her mouth went dry, but she nodded. Her experiences with the entire medical field were less than pleasant since she had come from a poor family that couldn't afford anything more than the charity care clinics scattered throughout the city. Overburdened, understaffed, and lacking in funds, she learned only to visit if there was a dire need. She always felt like just another body to get out of the way. Her mother died of pneumonia because an overworked doctor barely looked at her before claiming it was only a cold. Her father followed not long after due to a work accident. He lost too much blood, then ended up in an infection that was resistant to the generic antibiotics he was given. Lucky for Elise, she was already working and didn't end up in the system, though things didn't turn out as well for her siblings. As the oldest, she had always been too busy helping to bond with them, and she felt more like a nanny or a maid than an older sister. Giving her a tight smile, the man stepped back and gestured to the seat behind the desk. Go ahead, I'll be back in just a moment. Turning, he seemed to flee back through the door he had come from, shutting it firmly behind him. Elise could hear voices again on the other side, but they were too muffled to understand anything. Placing her bag on the desk, she stepped around it and took a seat. The creaking made her breath catch in her throat as she paused and waited for the chair to collapse beneath her, but it held. Why is your account restricted? Jackie, 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 Jackie. Lord have mercy. Okay. Elise filled out her information into the form on the screen. Name, age, registration number, the usual questions asked on government documents. When she reached the medical history, she felt her cheeks heat with embarrassment and jumped in surprise when the door behind her flew open. Turning to see who it was, she recognized the man that had come out before, but with him were two others. One was a short, older woman, baited by the scent of her, and who Elise assumed was the nurse since she wore a set of gray scrubs. Her pinched face was decidedly uninviting. Turning her eyes to the second man, a shiver rode down her spine. His shoulders filled the doorway as he glared down at her, his size alone stating he was an alpha. He was in a military uniform, and the gold bars on his collar marked him as an officer. His dusky blue skin was a surprise since there weren't many aliens on Earth, and his ice blue eyes made her skin crawl as he stared at her. Dropping her eyes to his chest, she didn't miss the flare of his nostrils as he scented her. What? Well, is she really an Omega? The nurse crossed her arms over her chest as Elise's eyes darted back to her. Her narrow gaze showed she fully expected the man beside her to say no, but her brows rose as he let out a rumble. Yes. All eyes focused on him as he kept his on Elise. His expression was less foreboding than it had been, but wasn't something she would call happy. It's faint, but the scent is there. She has time before her heat. Turning, he walked away as the others two stared after him. Their attention snapped back to Elise once she heard the door close behind them. The two looked at her for a moment before the nurse waved a hand at her to stand. Well, come on then. I'm not done with. Elise trailed off as the nurse flicked her fingers at her protest. We can finish that in the back. I have to go through all the questions anyway. Standing, Elise grabbed her bag and pulled the strap over her head. Giving the man who had first greeted her a polite smile as she passed, she followed the nurse down a tight hallway. There were doors on each side. The first one opened to reveal a break room where the blonde had most likely been when she arrived, but the others were all closed. They walked quite a while before the woman led her around a corner and stopped in front of a set of elevators. Pushing the button to go down, the nurse kept her back to Elise as they waited. So, what's your name, girl? We're on chapter 3, y'all. So, what's your name, girl? Jackie does nothing innocently. What are you talking about? You can't use that word in the same sentence as Jackie. The nurse didn't bother to look at her as they stepped into the elevator, tapping away on her tablet. Elise Carson. What the hell ever. We know you too well, Jackie, baby. And since we are all friends with you, innocent can't be applied to any of us. But especially to you, Karen, or bitch, as I like to call her, and the slut from Florida. The three of you are anything but innocent. Just gonna say that. But neither are any of the rest of us. Throw Neener Beaner in there too. Date of birth, July 23rd, 2070. She rattled on with the basic questions Elise had already answered on the computer as the elevator descended. Considering she had entered on the ground floor, it was a bit strange to be going down. When they finally came to a halt and the door slid open, the hallway ahead of them was as different from the one they left as it could get. Special. That's a good word. I'll go with that. Where the previous hall was the dingy off-white of a tired office building, this one was a pristine white that brought a hospital to mind. Brightly lit, the walls seemed to glow as the fluorescence shone off them. Leading her past more closed doorways, the nurse turned down an adjoining hall before reaching an open door at the opposite end. Inside was the usual sterile exam room. There was a reclined exam table, stool, a single chair where Elise placed her bag, a counter with a sink and various containers of medical supplies. It was a cold, impersonal, and unwelcoming. The nurse picked up the questioning with Elise's medical history. She had never smoked, nor done drugs, never drank, no surgeries or history of medical issues in her or her family. Her medical history was as plain and boring as the rest of her life had been, except for one thing. How many sexual partners? Elise felt heat rush up her chest and neck to burning her cheeks. She kept reminding herself that being a virgin was nothing to be ashamed about. It was all part of the plan, not because she was undesirable. None. Elise had taken a seat on the exam table and was studying her clasped hands when she flicked her gaze up to the nurse after a prolonged pause. She could see the disbelief on the woman's face. You've had no sexual partners in your entire life? Pulling her shoulders back, Elise nodded. That's correct. You realize you're about to receive a pelvic exam, and the doctor will be able to tell? Yes. Oh, for sure. And just so you know, that while you've been gone, the other two have gotten worse. Just saying. Yeah, I definitely read this because I was thinking there was something going on with the doctor when he did the pelvic exam. The questions were insulting, but Elise conceded that her status was hard to believe. She didn't know a single person her age that hadn't had at least one partner. Taking a deep breath and blowing it out, the nurse went back to tapping on her tablet. I guess we can skip the rest of these for now then. I need you to strip and lie on the table. Eyes darting around, Elise looked for the usual paper gown and drape you wore during an exam, but none were in sight. The nurse seemed to guess what she was looking for because she walked over to a cabinet and pulled out a pale green square barely large enough to cover the tops of her legs if Elise pressed them together. The gown is pointless since the doctor will be examining all of you and you just have to take it off again. His time is important and we can't keep him waiting. Strip and cover yourself with this if you must. Turning, she left the room, the door clicking shut behind her. Left speechless, Elise swallowed and slid to the floor. Slipping her feet out of the flats she had worn, she pushed them under the chair before pulling her dress over her head. Unhooking her bra, she folded it into her dress before placing them on top of her bag. Hesitant, she hooked her fingers into the sides of her panties. These exams were always uncomfortable, but this one was already worse than usual. Sighing, she slid them down her thighs and stuffed them under the dress before returning to her seat on the table. One arm crossed over her chest, Elise fidgeted with the square in her lap until she heard footsteps outside the door. It swung open without even a courtesy knock, the man striding in like he owned the world. Gray head held high. Hold on, what we got going here? Oh, it's just my brother. Gray head held high, his white coat hung from his lanky frame. His eyes were so dark behind his glasses it was hard to see where his iris ended and pupil began. The only reassuring thing was that his scent marked him as a beta. One side of his lips pulled up in a smirk that made shivers run down her spine. Maybe not so reassuring after all. He was still male. His eyes roamed over her body as he took a seat on the stool. I believe you were told to lie on the table. His voice was smooth in a way that made Elise think of grease coating the back of her tongue. Feeling herself flush, she dropped her eyes and obediently lay back, knees pressed together as her lower legs dangled over the end. Rolling closer, he pulled stirrups out of the table, locking them into place before tapping her on the knee. Sucking in a shaky breath, she lifted her leg and let him guide her foot to the stirrup. Both feet in place, the little square slid up to her stomach, leaving Elise a clear view of his face between her thighs. Core clenching in the natural instinct to protect herself, she could see the smile stretching his lips as he turned his attention to her face. Eyes never leaving hers, he reached over the counter and grabbed a pair of gloves. Since you told the nurse you're a virgin, I'll use my finger to begin the exam. It'll be less painful for you if you've never been stretched. His stomach turned as he rode closer and his gaze dropped back to her core. The doctor's hand moved to the top of her mound, his finger and thumb spreading her lips as his palm pressed down to hold her hips in place. She still jerked when his other hand brushed over her clit and she could see his eyes light up as his smirk grew. Elise felt felt his finger run down the edge of her inner lip before he pressed it to her entrance, causing her to tense. Thrusting it in until the backs of his knuckles pressed against her, she couldn't stop the gasp when he pulled out and shoved in a second without letting her adjust. Pushing up with the tips of his fingers, he twisted his hand back and forth before removing them. I'll need to use a speculum to ascertain if your hymen is still intact. You should try to relax. Omegas are the end. They are the bottom feeders, so to speak. It goes alpha, beta, omega. And sometimes there's some more in between there, but mostly it's just alpha, beta, and omega. Think in terms of a pack of dogs or a pack of wolves. Same principle. Only the omegas in these are the ones that bear the children. Yeah, betas don't do anything but mess everything else up. After the lack of gentleness with his fingers, the thought of him thrusting the speculum into her with the same suddenness had every muscle in her body tightening. Eyes focused on the ceiling, Elise jumped at the sound of a drawer opening and shutting below her. Almost to the point of panting, she was everything other than relaxed. She jerked when she felt his hand touch the inside of her thigh, and he let out a chuckle. Shh, I'll go easy. Virgin would be a virgin would be a special thing. Chapter 4. Elise felt the speculum press against her, its blunt tip larger than his fingers had been. Taking a deep breath, she forced herself to unclench. He didn't press it in far before she felt it open, the clicks of the instrument causing her legs to twitch. She was spread wide, her opening burning at the unaccustomed stretch. Well, it appears you are a virgin after all. She ignored the surprise in his voice, focusing on counting the little black dots in the ceiling tile above her. The man seemed to enjoy her discomfort, and she didn't want to give him any more satisfaction. I just need to take a swab, and then we'll be done with this part. That was an odd sensation inside her, and then he was removing the speculum. Elise let out a sigh of relief as she clenched her knees together, heels still spread wide by the stirrups. She tried to soothe herself with the thought that the worst was over. The doctor rolled away, standing and turning to the counter to do whatever was necessary with the swab, as she sat up and covered her lap. Wrapping an arm around her chest, she waited for him to leave. Turning back to face her, he raised an eyebrow. Stand facing me. Her brows drew together in confusion, and the doctor gave her another greasy smile. I still need to perform my inspection, and you have to be photographed. Unsure what he meant, Elise slid to the floor, doing as he instructed. She tried to hold the paper against her, but the doctor came closer and pulled it from her hand. Arms at your sides. Holding up his tablet, he circled Elise. She never expected him to photograph her naked, but it didn't surprise her. She reminded herself she was a commodity meant to make money for her government. The man was only a little taller than her, and when he finished with the tablet, he set it down and stepped in front of her again. Placing his palm on her shoulders, his hands were dry and cold. She shivered at his touch, goosebumps rising along her arms as he ran his hands down them. Stopping at her wrist, he said, Now, out to the sides. Lifting her arms, Elise jumped when she felt his hands on her hips. Easy there. His tone was teasing, but it set her teeth on edge. Her jaw clenched as he moved his palm up her sides the way he touched her, feeling far more personal than a health exam. When he reached the sides of her chest, he paused. Raising her eyes back to the ceiling, Elise knew what was coming. Telling herself it would be over soon, she tried to keep her breathing even as his hands wrapped around her breast. Squeezing and pushing them together, his eyes were fixed on her chest when she glanced down. His tongue slipping out to wet his lips made her jerk her gaze upwards again, unwilling to watch his expression as he violated her. Turning his hands with each squeeze, he made a mockery of feeling for lumps like doctors had at her previous exams. He gripped tight enough that she began to wince with each squeeze, her breast growing tender. Elise yelped in surprise when he pinched her nipples, jerking away and cupping her abused flesh. The doctor just chuckled, shrugging with one shoulder. I needed to check for sensitivity. Do you have any pain anywhere? Shaking her head, she kept her eyes on him as he began to circle. She wanted nothing more than for this man to leave, but his expression said he wasn't done with her yet. Turn and place your hands on the table. Her jaw dropped at his order, but the grin that had been on his face throughout the visit disappeared, replaced with a cold, uncaring visage. If I cannot complete my inspection, I will have to list you as damaged since I can't attest otherwise. Throat working to swallow the lump that had formed, Elise felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She'd seen people abuse their power plenty of times, and they only did it when they knew they wouldn't be punished. Trembling, her gaze moved to the table, hands reaching out without conscious thought, palms flat on the vinyl surface. She waited for whatever was coming. Was her virginity not valued as highly as she thought it was? Or would he lie and say he hadn't been one to begin with? She hadn't been one to begin with. Muscles tensing as she heard him move behind her, she clenched her eyes shut. He started at her shoulders again, fingers stroking the sides of her neck, hands spread wide. He began to move down her spine, dipping to the sides to brush against the outside of her breast once again. His fingers tightened when they got to her hips, pulling her until she was forced to take a step back, further exposing herself to him. Head hanging between her arms, Elise tried to hold back the tears. His grip on her bottom was just as hard as it had been on her chest, and when he attempted to pull her cheeks apart, she clenched and jerked forward. He made an irritated sound as he clutched her hips again, pulling her even further back and using his foot to kick out until she was forced to spread them apart. Tears leaked from the corner of her eyes, wetting her face before dripping to the floor. Holding her breath so she didn't sob, Elise shuddered as she felt a finger begin to stroke down the crease of her butt. The finger circled her back hole, causing her to flinch before moving further down to force its way between the lips of her sex. Finding her entrance dry, he clucked his tongue and she heard a drawer slide open. Knees shaking, the first drop of fluid caused her to gasp. 3 more drops followed before he removed his finger. The sounds she heard terrified her. A zipper. Wet sounds. Jumping when his hands returned to her bottom, Elise couldn't stop the cry that left her throat. Be a good girl and this won't hurt. You might enjoy it. His voice was soft, like he thought it would comfort her. Finger sliding through the lube he had dripped along her cleft, he pressed one hand flat on her spine as he reached under the other to her clit. Circling it twice, she cried out again when he pinched it between his fingers. It was painful. Moving up, he stroked her lower lips. Elise knew this was beyond professional. There was nothing clinical about what this man was doing to her, but she couldn't find her voice. Words had abandoned her. Expecting to feel him press inside her, she wasn't expecting him to do it to her back hole. Arms collapsing, she lurched forward, chest hitting the exam table with a grunt. eyes and mouth opened wide. She could barely let out a squeak as he buried his finger in her ass before cramming in a second. She felt the doctor's pants brush against the back of her thighs, and she slid farther over the table as his other hand left her back. Moving his fingers within, Elise could feel his body shaking, but she didn't understand what was happening until she felt the blunt heat of his cock press into her thighs. He made a few shallow thrusts, rubbing his head along her dry slit as he jerked himself. Twisting the fingers inside her, he pulled away with a grunt, and she felt hot fluid splash her bottom and the back of her thighs. Okay, this is going to be the last chapter, y'all. I have a voice to hang on to, so here we go. Chapter 5. Elise was too stunned to react. Breath caught in her throat as her mind tried to catch up. The doctor stepped away from her, and she heard water running, but she remained where she was, unsure what to do. Get dressed. The nurse will be back in a moment. Voice void of any further interest, the doctor left, door clicking behind him. Her tears stopped as numbness spread from her chest. The whirling thoughts ended with the click of the door, her mind a blank fog that seemed too thick to push through. Not that she wanted to. This experience would go in the box in her mind that she didn't visit, the one full of things she didn't want to remember. Standing, Elise found some wipes, cleaning the mess from her bottom as well as she could. Pulling her clothes back on, she sat in the chair against the wall, hands folded over the bag in her lap. She didn't bother to look up when the nurse entered. Elise couldn't believe the nurse didn't know what the doctor did to the omegas he processed, and she didn't want to see her fake smile and pretend interest. I need to take a bit of blood to be sure you're healthy. Rolling her arm, Elise held it out, her eyes still focused on the floor in front of her. The nurse pressed a device to her forearm, a quick prick followed by a green light, and then she was hustling Elise out the door. Taking the elevator again, they went up 2 floors before she left Elise in another waiting room. This one was small, barely large enough for the coffee table and 4 surrounding chairs, but at least it was clean. Elise didn't sit there long before she heard heels click on the tile hallway. Elise? She looked up into the startling orange eyes of a woman in a white blouse and pencil skirt. Her platinum blonde locks were tucked behind her pointed ears, but the rest of her looked human. Yes? Her throat felt thick, but the brain fog thinned enough to focus on the new person. Taking the last few steps toward her, the woman held out her hand. I'm sorry. I'll be the one finding your match. Now that you're all done with medical, I'll be asking you a few more questions about your life to be sure we find someone who will be more than just genetically compatible. The woman wore a bright smile like she believed her words. A small part of Elise wanted to tell her she wasn't a fool, that she knew they were putting her up for sale to the highest bidder, and it had nothing to do with genetics or improving the species. Not if you're an omega. Instead, she forced herself to smile back and take her hand. If you'll follow me to my office, we'll get this finished so you can settle in. You'll stay here until we have a match for you. Depending on where they are in the universe, they'll come and take you to your new home. Elise listened to her cheery dialogue, letting it pull her further away from the experience on the other floor. You would think something like that would be hard to move on from, but sorry, y'all. But the mind learns to protect itself when exposed to traumatizing events. Oh, that's because we're not omegas. We wouldn't ever have to worry about all that. Suri walked with an easy grace that Elise ached to be able to imitate, and next to her she felt like a toddler waddling along the hall. She realized that unlike the medical personnel, Suri didn't smell like a beta, but it took a moment to register that she was an omega. Suri smelled different than the others she had met, but she wasn't sure if it was something to do with her heritage or if she was bonded. Scanning her neck with interest, Elise caught a glimpse of a scar as Suri leaned forward to take her seat. So, I need to know a bit about your background and education. Where are you from? I was born in Low End. We moved a lot, but I did well in school until I had to start working. The woman began typing on her tablet. It shows here you completed your 11th year but didn't enroll for year 12. Yes, I have five younger siblings. There wasn't room for me anymore, so I had to find work. Suri's orange eyes lifted to Elise. Your parents left you on your own at 16? Elise shrugged her shoulder. I found a job in a hotel. They let me stay and provided 2 meals a day. My parents died shortly after I left anyway. Suri seemed surprised by Elise's words, but it was a frequent story in Low End. Many kids were on their own by that age, even having children of their own. Elise had been lucky to find a job on the edge of the district where things weren't as bad. It meant she had the opportunity to work her way up until she earned a transfer to a different district. So, no formal education after that. Any special training? Courses you took while working? She shook her head and shrugged again, but Suri gave her a smile. Don't worry, many alphas don't expect or want their mate to work. The questions are just to learn more about you. Elise nodded, trying to fake a smile in return. Any special interests or hobbies? Her brows drew together, and Suri must have seen her confusion. Do you sing, dance, play an instrument? Elise couldn't stop her snort, as if she had ever had time for anything frivolous like learning to play an instrument. She hadn't had a day off in over 3 years. No, I'm a passable cook and I can sew. Besides that, cleaning is all I know. What are you looking for in a mate? Suri's brows raised as Elise stared at her. Though Elise turned herself in, it didn't change the fact that she didn't have a choice in the end. She would have been hunted down within the next year or two, brought in during a raid, and this had been the better option. Suri sat with a patient smile, like her question wasn't completely pointless. Elise had never considered what she wanted in a mate because she knew she wouldn't get to pick one. She decided to be blunt. Someone that can provide for me and any children we have. He's not going to hurt me, who's not going to hurt me or them. When Suri managed to keep her smile, it looked strained, and she couldn't stop the way her eyes widened. It took her a moment to respond. Oh, honey, no one is going to hurt you. The alphas in our database have all been vetted. They are well respected men looking to settle down with a mate and raise a family. Elise wanted to believe her words, but what happened downstairs proved what she had heard her whole life. Omegas were used by the higher dynamics, fucked and bred and sold for profit. Her only hope was to find someone rich enough to keep and protect her that she could grow to care about as their bond developed. All right, let's see what I'm missing here. He is pretty good. All right, ladies. So go get the book. It's called Used by Leann Ryans. It's the first book in the series. If you have problems finding it, just talk to Bitch on here. She'll get you there, or come see me. It is a good book, though, especially as an introduction into the omegaverse stuff. Because some of them out there get really, really, really weird and out there, okay? But this particular book is pretty tame, and it's a good entrance book into it. So, and just know that it's different. It's not like a regular boy meets girl kind of thing. And it's even different than a lot of alien books, even though this is an alien book. It's still different than a lot of alien books you read. So, alrighty. Who's taking care of my schedule? Do I have a live read tomorrow night? I don't even know. Are we gonna see each other tomorrow night? Now I'm not gonna guarantee anything tomorrow night because we got red alert day tomorrow. Next 2 days. Okay. Looks like I have Miss Theta tomorrow. Rebel Torture. All right. So tomorrow night we got Miss Theta James. Whoop, whoop. You know that one's going to be good. So, alrighty. Y'all get ready to come back and we'll have a good one. All right, ladies. I'll talk to you later and happy reading.